My daughter answered the phone expecting the usual 10-minute call, the one where I tell her the weather's beautiful, and the fish tacos were good, and everything is fine, and instead she got 40 minutes of me finally telling her the truth about the last 3 years, my voice breaking somewhere around minute 12, in a way I don't think either of us had heard since her mother's funeral. 28 years in the United States Army, retired as a command sergeant major, a man trained to project calm competence under literal enemy fire. And it took a second broken bone in a country where I didn't speak the language well enough to explain what happened to a doctor, before I finally admitted to my own daughter that I'd been struggling since almost the day I arrived. I want to walk you through those 3 hidden years, why I hid them, and what finally broke through 28 years of training that told me never to. If you're new to this channel, subscribe, because I tell the real, sometimes uncomfortable version of these stories every week. My name is Ronald Turner, I'm 67 years old, and I spent 28 years in the Army. Working my way up from a private to command sergeant major, the senior enlisted position in a battalion, responsible for the welfare and discipline of hundreds of soldiers across 3 combat deployments, and a career's worth of postings from Fort Bragg to Germany to Fort Hood. I remember, specifically, a young soldier under my command during my second deployment, who came to me privately, admitting he was struggling badly with what we'd now clearly recognize as depression, and I handled that conversation, at the time with genuine compassion, got him connected with proper support, made sure his unit protected him rather than judged him. I was by every account, good at recognizing that struggle in the men and women serving under me. It never once occurred to me, across 28 years, that I might someday need to recognize that exact same struggle in myself, or that decades of training other people to trust me with their weakness would leave me almost entirely unable to show mine to anyone at all. My marriage to my ex-wife Carol didn't survive the deployments, something that happens to a genuinely high percentage of military marriages, and that I've made a kind of uneasy peace with over the 22 years since our divorce. My daughter Jessica and my son Brian both grew up mostly with Carol, and while I stayed present in the specific limited way a career soldier's schedule allows, I've spent most of the last 2 decades living alone. Something I'd genuinely convinced myself I was entirely fine with. I retired from active duty at 55, spent another 10 years working as a private security consultant, mostly training contracts overseas, and finally, fully retired at 65, sat down and did the math on where that pension and my consulting savings would actually stretch furthest. Zihuatanejo, a fishing town on Mexico's Pacific coast in the state of Guerrero, kept surfacing in my research, a place with genuine natural beauty, a manageable cost of living, and, critically for a man who'd spent 28 years in structured, disciplined environments, a slow, laid-back rhythm I told myself would be exactly what I needed after 3 decades of exactly the opposite. I flew down for a single scouting week, found a small rental near Playa La Ropa within 3 days, and moved permanently 4 months later, alone, the way I'd approached most major transitions across my adult life, efficiently, without much ceremony, and without asking either of my kids for much input beyond a courtesy phone call letting them know the decision was already made. I want to be direct about something before I get into what actually happened, because I think it matters to anyone watching this who comes from a military or first responder background themselves. 28 years of service trains a specific set of instincts into you that serve you extremely well in combat, and extremely poorly in ordinary civilian life. You learn to compartmentalize pain, physical and emotional both. You learn that admitting you're struggling is, functionally, a liability, something that gets soldiers under your command hurt if you're not operating at full capacity. You learn to project competence and control at all times, regardless of what's actually happening underneath it. Those instincts saved my life more than once across 3 deployments, and I'd never once questioned them, not seriously, until I found myself alone in a rented house 3,000 miles from anyone who actually knew me, applying the exact same training to a situation it was never designed to handle. I carried every single one of those instincts into my retirement in Zihuatanejo, and for 3 years. They nearly cost me everything. The first real trouble started about 4 months after I arrived. I fell on a wet tile staircase in my rental, alone, on a Tuesday afternoon, and broke my wrist badly enough that I genuinely could see it wasn't sitting right even before the swelling set in. My Spanish at that point was nearly non-existent. I hadn't yet built any real local relationships. And rather than figuring out how to get myself to a clinic and explain what had happened, I did something that in hindsight is almost impossible to justify rationally. I said it myself, as best I could, with an improvised splint from materials in my kitchen, the exact field first aid training I'd used on soldiers in far worse circumstances decades earlier. and told myself I'd get it looked at once I found a doctor I trusted. I didn't get it properly looked at for 11 days, by which point it had begun healing wrong, and the eventual corrective treatment, once I finally did see a doctor, involved a second, deliberate re-breaking of the bone, and a longer recovery than a same-day fracture would have required. A genuinely avoidable complication that existed entirely, because I'd rather have handled it wrong alone than handled it right with anyone else's involvement. I told Jessica, during our regular Sunday call that same week, that everything was going great, sent her a photo of the sunset from my terrace, and never once mentioned the wrist. I want to comment down below and ask honestly, how many of you have done some version of this, curated exactly what your family sees of a struggle you're actually navigating alone? Because I suspect this particular pattern runs far deeper across an entire generation than any of us like to admit. The financial side of that first year turned out harder than I'd projected too, not catastrophically, but meaningfully. I'd budgeted based on cost of living figures that assumed a level of Spanish fluency and local navigation I simply didn't have yet. Paying tourist prices for services locals would have gotten considerably cheaper. Hiring an English-speaking handyman for repairs I later learned I'd overpaid for by nearly double. Once I finally understood enough Spanish to compare notes with a neighbor about what he'd paid for a nearly identical job. By month 8, my savings were depleting faster than my spreadsheet had projected, and instead of calling Brian, an accountant back in Texas, who could have run the numbers properly in an afternoon, and probably identified the exact overpayment pattern within minutes, I simply tightened my own spending further, quietly, alone, treating the miscalculation as a personal failure to be corrected through discipline, rather than a problem worth asking for help with. I remember specifically skipping meals some weeks that first year, not from genuine scarcity. My pension was more than adequate on paper, but from a kind of self-imposed austerity I applied as punishment for having miscalculated in the first place, the exact irrational logic of a man determined to solve every problem through willpower, rather than admitting a mistake out loud to anyone who could actually help correct it. The isolation compounded everything else, and this is the part I think I hid most successfully. Because loneliness doesn't show up in a photograph the way a cast or a thin bank statement might. I made almost no real friends that first year. I'd nod at other American retirees at the small expat gatherings I occasionally forced myself to attend, exchange pleasantries, and leave early, genuinely unable to explain, even to myself, why building actual friendships felt so much harder here than it ever had reporting to a new posting every 2 or 3 years throughout my entire career. I think, looking back, that military life had always handed me my community, pre-packaged, built into the structure of the job itself, a unit that trained together, ate together, and had each other's backs by design rather than by anyone's individual effort. I'd never once had to build community from scratch, alone, as a civilian, and I discovered, 3,000 miles from anyone who'd have recognized the specific way I go quiet when I'm struggling, that I genuinely didn't know how. By year 2 I was, by any honest clinical description, dealing with real depression, sleeping poorly, eating carelessly, spending long stretches of most days simply sitting on my terrace watching the bay without much energy for anything beyond it. I want to be careful here, because I don't want to overstate the drama of it for the sake of a compelling video. It wasn't a crisis in any single dramatic moment. It was a slow, steady flattening, week after week, month after month, the specific gray erosion that depression actually looks like far more often than the version you see dramatized on television. And every single Sunday call to Jessica, every occasional call to Brian, I performed wellness with the exact discipline I'd once brought to a command briefing, curated photos, upbeat updates, careful redirection whenever either of them asked a question that got too close to how I was actually doing. Jessica told me, much later, that she'd sensed something was off during several of those calls, a flatness in my voice she couldn't quite name, but that she'd never once imagined the actual scope of what I was hiding, because I'd spent her entire life being the parent who handled things. And some part of her, I think, had simply never developed the instinct to push past that presentation and ask harder questions. The second fall happened in month 34, almost exactly 3 years in, a slip on the same kind of wet tile that had broken my wrist years earlier, this time on my hip, pain severe enough that I genuinely could not stand up on my own. Lying on my kitchen floor for close to 20 minutes, running through the same familiar instinct to simply wait it out, before I finally accepted that this particular injury was beyond even my own field medic instincts to manage alone. I remember the specific moment the decision actually shifted, staring at my kitchen ceiling. Genuinely frightened in a way 3 decades of combat deployments had rarely made me, and understanding with a clarity that felt almost like a physical blow, that if I didn't call someone right now, I might genuinely be found days later by a neighbor who'd noticed my mail piling up. I called Jessica, not a local clinic, not the American consulate's emergency line I'd actually researched and saved months earlier without ever once using it, my own daughter, 3,000 miles away. Because in that specific moment of genuine helplessness, 28 years of never asking for help simply had nowhere left to hide. She got me connected with a local ambulance service through a frantic series of calls, stayed on the phone with me for the better part of an hour while I waited, her voice the only thing keeping me from the specific panic that comes from being alone, injured, and unable to fully explain your situation in a language you don't speak. Somewhere in that hour, lying on my kitchen floor unable to move, the entire performance I'd maintained for 3 years finally, completely collapsed. I told her everything, the wrist I'd hidden 3 years earlier, the financial miscalculation, the isolation, the depression I'd never once named out loud to another human being. The whole accumulated weight of a stoicism I'd mistaken for strength coming apart in a single unplanned hour on a tile floor. Jessica stayed for 2 weeks, helping me through the early recovery, and during those 2 weeks, we had the kind of extended, honest conversation neither of us had really had in decades, not since before her mother and I divorced. She told me, near the end of that visit, that she'd spent years quietly worried about exactly this pattern in me, present but emotionally sealed, and that watching me finally, actually break down on that kitchen floor phone call, had been terrifying but also, somehow, the first time in years she'd felt like she was talking to her real father, instead of the composed version I'd been presenting. Since she was a teenager. She also told me something that landed harder than almost anything else that visit, that Brian had confided a nearly identical suspicion to her over the years, both of them independently sensing something was off in my calls, but neither willing to push past my carefully maintained front, each assuming the other would eventually say something if it were truly serious. A specific kind of family silence that I recognized, uncomfortably, as my own instinct reflected right back at me through both of my children. I've done things differently in the year and a half since that fall. I joined a local expat coffee group I'd been avoiding for 3 years, forced myself through the specific discomfort of building actual friendships from scratch the way I'd never had to as a soldier, sitting through several genuinely awkward first meetings before slowly finding 2 or 3 people, a retired teacher from Oregon and a fellow veteran from the Marines, who I now consider genuine friends rather than pleasant acquaintances I nod at. I hired a proper Spanish tutor rather than muddling through alone, a patient woman named Carmen who's also, gently but persistently, become something like an informal check-in presence in my week, noticing on more than one occasion when I've seemed off, and asking about it directly in a way I've had to consciously train myself to actually answer honestly rather than deflect. I've made a standing arrangement with Jessica and Brian both, a genuine weekly check-in every Sunday where I've committed, deliberately, to actually answering the question of how I'm doing rather than deflecting it with a sunset photo, and I'll admit those calls still cost me something every single week. A small, specific effort to override 28 years of training that tells me the honest answer is a burden rather than a gift. Brian, true to his profession, actually sat down with me over video call and rebuilt my entire retirement budget properly, identifying exactly the overpayment patterns I'd been quietly absorbing alone for years. And I've saved a meaningful amount each month since simply by finally letting my own son do the job he's actually trained for, instead of insisting on handling it myself, badly. Out of pride. I still catch the old instinct sometimes, the specific pull toward handling something alone rather than admitting I need help, a small kitchen leak last month, that I genuinely had to stop myself from attempting to fix alone at 11 at night, rather than simply waiting until morning and calling a proper plumber. An almost comically small example, but one that reminded me exactly how deep that 28-year-old wiring actually runs. I've come to understand that instinct will probably never fully leave a man who spent nearly 3 decades being trained into it, and I've stopped expecting it to disappear entirely. But I recognize it now, the moment it arrives. The way I used to recognize an incoming threat on a job site or a battlefield, and I've built, slowly with Jessica's patient help, the specific discipline of choosing honesty over performance, even when every trained reflex in me still pushes toward the opposite. Jessica visited again 3 months ago, our second trip together since the hip surgery, and we sat on that same terrace where I used to perform wellness for 3 curated years, actually talking. No photo staged for a Sunday call, no careful redirection when the conversation drifted toward something harder. She asked me, near the end of that visit, whether I regretted the 3 years I'd spent hiding everything, and I told her honestly that I did, not because struggling itself was avoidable. Life hands out struggle regardless of how well you've planned, but because I'd spent 3 years navigating it entirely alone when I'd had 2 grown children the whole time, who'd have shown up in a heartbeat had I simply let them know I needed them. I think about that specific waste often now, not the struggle itself, but the 3 years of unnecessary solitude I layered on top of it, purely out of a pride I'd mistaken, my entire adult life, for strength. If any part of this sounded familiar, if you've spent months or years performing wellness for the people who love you instead of actually telling them the truth, I hope you find your own version of that kitchen floor moment sooner than I found mine, and that it doesn't take a genuine emergency to finally get you there. 28 years of service taught me how to recognize danger in almost anyone but myself. It's taken these last 3 hard years, and a daughter who refused to let me disappear back into old habits once she finally saw the truth, to start learning that second, harder skill properly, late in life, but not, I hope, too late to matter. I'm Ronald Turner. Thank you for listening to Retired in Mexico.